Okay, hello everybody. This is the Kubernetes SIG architecture meeting for June 18th, 2020. Um, please, we have a pretty full house today, so I just want to remind everybody that we have a code of conduct to be kind to one another and respectful. So please follow that. And with that, why don't we get started? I believe the first item on the agenda, Jordan, was that you?
Yep, that's me. Hey. All right. So I sent an email to the list last week sometime. There'd been an issue opened, I think against the Kubernetes repo, asking about switching from like whitelist, blacklist terminology to something else, like allow list or deny list or something else. And so a couple PRs had been opened off of that issue, one for the website and one for our API documentation. And since that touches recommendations, API guidelines for field names we would choose in the future, I wanted to bring it up here. So since I sent that list, I think both of those PRs actually got reviewed and merged. In this case, I think it was a pretty easy call. Our documentation is often sadly neglected, and so if someone like pays attention to part of it and like actually works to phrase things more coherently, I think it was a net benefit for both of those cases, and there was basically no downside. No, it wasn't breaking any compatibility issues or anything. So it was a pure win for both of those instances. But it kind of raised bigger questions. I think Stephen Augustus had poked a thread a while back around the terminology we use around control plane members. Originally, it was a master minion. I've seen maybe in documentation, master slave metaphors. The nodes were never actually called that, but I think we settled on like control plane and something else, worker, something like that. Anyway, Stephen had poked that thread, and then there had been discussion this past week also about the use of master as a default branch in Git. Anyway, there's a lot of attention being paid to terminology and whether it's helpful, whether it's distracting, whether it can be changed, should be changed, and what the costs of changing that are. So I wanted to bring it up here. And if Stephen is on the call, is Stephen here?
Hi, friends. Yep.
Hey. Since there are, these are like three examples of questions about naming and maybe things to consider around naming that haven't been considered in the past. And so I think Stephen had started the thread proposing a group looking specifically at that. So I'll hand it over to you to describe your thread.
Yes. So yes, naming is hard. We know that. We've known that for some time. I think that to tag on to some of the stuff that Jordan was saying, I have Celeste and Zach here as well. We're proposing a working group that cross-cuts and will hopefully be sponsored by SIG Docs, SIG Contributor Experience, and SIG Architecture to discuss naming across the project. Part of this is related to that previous thread and threads that we've had in the past. Some fairly toxic that were locked in the past due to the conversation from non-contributors. So we want to move forward in a more effective and thoughtful way here. So SIG Docs and SIG Contributor Experience have approved, have decided to sponsor this. So we're looking for additional approval on the SIG architecture side to move this forward. Essentially, we would be looking into various areas in the project that have our first goal. Let's not to dilute anything. The first goal will be to target racist and non-inclusive language in the project and tackle that. So there have been a variety of issues and PRs that have been opened in the past few weeks related to this. And one, we want to make sure that the thread that was initially started in all of the previous threads actually drive towards some resolution, because it has been almost a year to date, I think, when that thread was initially proposed, and no motion has happened there. And second, we want a singular place for people to discuss this activity. I think that seeing issues pop up in KubeBuilder and website and Kubernetes, and having different people be part of different conversations leading to different resolutions is not necessarily productive for the project. So that is that's the impetus for the working group, and we wanted to bring it to you here today to get thoughts from SIG chairs, SIG technical leads, and contributors overall.
Question, is the idea of this working group that it will come up with the principles by which we decide which pieces of language are, say, inclusive or exclusive, or will this working group itself be empowered to make that determination directly?
I think that what we want to do is provide guidelines, process, and procedure for one, discussing this stuff overall as a community, and then also driving towards that change. I think that the sub-projects, the SIGs that we've included, I think would be ultimately delegated that decision. From the API level, API documentation and processes, I would see that as SIG architecture. From the process guidelines overall, I see that as a commingling of SIG docs and contributor experience. So the eventual hope is to provide enough of a basis and guidance that this can not just be used in the Kubernetes in the Kubernetes project, but also in other CNCF projects. We've actually already started the discussion around that, and the SIG, we're bringing that up as a topic for the maintainer circle and SIG contributor strategy on the CNCF level, so that we can discuss this across multiple projects. So.
Quick question, Stephen. You had mentioned that there is a Google Doc that's floating around with some of the things that could be looked at. Of those items, how many of them or which ones directly pertain to this SIG?
So potentially things around whitelist, blacklist, allow, deny list. I'm not sure. Like we haven't done the dig into the API stuff just yet. But I think our main concern was I'm fairly certain that we from the API level we're not using kind of master slave references, but allow, deny is or white black is more likely. So the short answer is we don't have the answers yet, but we thought it important to bring it to y'all to if people have context already.
I mean, I was gonna say, I think we have a couple of known places where we have API level ones. I think we want to make sure that we have a good process for if we do, as we talk about terminology and as the working group continues, having a set of ways of thinking about how an API change, if it became necessary, would be staged over time. Like I think the one place where we actually do use mastering terminology was problematic for other reasons, which the original issue actually called up, which was like, we shouldn't have even been doing this in the first place, right? Like there was using the node labels to mean something and coupling a bunch of meanings. That's taken about a year to unwind right now, but it's been something that's been in motion. We generally have been pretty responsive to it in the how do you stage API changes, but would everybody understand how long some of these changes make, and making sure that that's clear. Like we will change documentation, or we will, when we have problematic concerns, we react to those quickly. And then we communicate how the process for the other changes, if they do become, if those problematic things extend into API, the process, here's how we're taking into account the concerns of the language, and here's how we're taking into account the concerns of the people running it, and here's how we're going to stage that change. It's kind of that process, I think, is where a lot of people reacted to it, which was like, oh no, we have to go make big, scary changes. Having that framework to talk about that is very useful. Like how, understanding the balance of factors is really what I think addresses a lot of the what I would call fear of change there.
So it looks like Aaron, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so I was just going to ask, like, working groups are supposed to be temporary. They're supposed to disband once they have successfully accomplished their mission. So maybe I'm re-asking David's question, but like, what is the exit criteria for this working group? At what point do you disband?
To be determined, honestly. I think the first steps are to eliminate language that is very clearly harmful to contributors, and work on establishing policies. Short version, I don't have the answer yet, but I think that it was important to start the conversation. But yes, I do agree that it should be time bounded, and ideally these policies will move quickly to live inside of the SIGs that sponsor.
So, Stephen, so in terms of what this working group will need from SIG architecture is a place to codify the policies that you come up with and make sure that, like, we have the API review stuff, right? That's just, we don't really have code here, right? But we have the policies that we lay down for the API reviews, and then we have a mechanism to like work the issue about like, how is this API review good? Is this PR good, right? So is that what you're looking for from this group?
Yeah, I think from this group, it's from the API level. If it eventually becomes a link out to a doc that is maintained by contributor experience that provides guidance around language within the project, then I think that should suffice. As Clayton mentioned, there's a process for moving through changes. So I think at least making that process more visible, especially when we bring in new language or we want to change language, is important. So I think really just connecting threads between multiple SIGs, even if it's a few lines within documentation.
So I guess my question was, maybe you just answered it, but I'm wondering about the actual changes that need to be effected. So like, okay, you may determine policy that says this language is unnecessary, and then will this working group be going in and saying, identify these are the 7 fields in the API that are going to need to be changed, and who's responsible for the PRs? Is that going to go back to the SIGs? Will the working group stay in existence until those are completed? Kind of what's the actual, I worry about just making a pronouncement and not following through, because it will just fall, the SIGs may not like people to be able to do it, but people have a lot of things going on. So if the people are particularly want to make this happen, I think following through on the changes probably is more likely to make it succeed.
Right. So I think part of that will be understanding a little better the places that we might need to change. Right. So I think once we have an understanding of that, we can kind of drive forward. This is something that is actually in an API, right? Like if this is something that needs to be guidance, then it becomes guidance, right? And documentation is fairly simple. If it's something that's on the API level, then we need to say like, okay, well, this needs to exist until we have owners for making this change and carrying it through any API change periods, right? So it may range over a set of cycles to get that done. So I think that I think that on the architecture side, it's the handoff from working group back to SIG should be fairly quick. I think on the docs and contributor experience side, it'll be more of a continuing effort to ensure that we have consistent policies in place for handling this across the project.
Sorry, I think it's Jordan's turn.
Am I? Okay. So I had a couple comments about the workgroup naming proposal. So whenever I see sort of intentionally ambiguous goals, I worry a little bit. And so I think crisping up like what the deliverables would be, what the goals are, would be helpful for me. I also am a little concerned by like including charged language in the goals. I think it's good to be as helpful as we can to our contributors and our consumers, and be as descriptive and non-distracting, and like it's helpful to hear that some of the terms that we use or have used are problematic for some of our users. That's helpful to hear. I am concerned that by saying things like eliminate racist language, we will get bogged down in arguments about whether some things are racist or not, and will create an environment of fear for contributors or people who want to participate in this working group or want to help with these changes, but are just afraid of the label racist for terms that are actually maybe in their context not racist. So I am in favor of being helpful and clear and avoiding distraction and avoiding using terms that are unhelpful. But if we set those as the principles, then I think that helps us have those discussions in much more constructive ways. And then I think it just sidesteps unnecessary arguments. If someone says this term is problematic, then you, for this person or this group for this reason, then that's less of an argument than saying, well, I don't think it's racist because blah, 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 or because if you look at the etymology of the word, blah, blah, blah. Like if you say it's unhelpful and we can change it to something that is more helpful, then let's change it. So I think that might be a more constructive way to frame what we're shooting for.
And that's fair. I did include in the email racist and non-inclusive. So if we want to move towards the non-inclusive, where we see that the language is potentially causing harm to potential and existing contributors, and I think that we can do that safely. And yeah, I've already seen this Twitter threads, all the stuff. Like this is ballooning quite quickly. Christoph already reported a user for something in related projects. So
and to add to Jordan's point, I want to I think framing it in terms of terms like master slave are confusing, and like have a history, and they are unhelpful, and they create problems, and they're not even very good descriptions. Like a lot of times we say, there's a history of using this term in this context. But in many of the examples that we've come up with, they're actually far more accurate terms that we could use. I think sometimes, as a project, we have said, consistency internally is important. I think there's an angle here, which is consistency to, body of literature arguments are less convincing to me than having a very clear, precise term that describes exactly what we care about. And the consistency, if you argue, oh, well, the term master for the elected element is a term that's in use. There was a discussion the other day, which is, well, leaseholder or lockholder is a far more accurate term and is actually more clear. And so to add to Jordan's point, in terms of clear and concise and helpful terminology is an additive thing that I don't think there can be disagreement about, is we're finding the right term for it versus terms that come with baggage because they're historical.
My comment is maybe a generalization of Jordan's point, which is I think it'd be helpful if we went about these things with blameless postmortem standards, right? I actually don't think there's too much out there that needs to be changed, but there's possibly stuff that is in the API name or in a config file, or there could be stuff that takes a long time to change without breaking users. And I think it would be helpful for getting people on board if we spoke about such things without basically calling the people who put the words in to begin with. People make mistakes, okay? And I think it'd be helpful. I think people respond better if we can ask them to change without assuming ill intent.
I don't think that this is intended to indict anyone who has committed code or worked on an API or documentation in the past.
Sure.
It's to provide provide a positive base moving forward.
Yeah, I guess I think some email, I don't know who, it doesn't matter. Somebody called it hateful language. I think it's in one sense, yeah, I can see how it merits the label, but it's very difficult for people to separate themselves from the words that they say, and I think I think people will drag in intentions and assume that you're not calling just their language, but they themselves are hateful, and I think that makes this a lot more confrontational than it would need to be. So that would be my plea is if we could go about this in blameless postmortem standards. And then, I mean, if somebody does demonstrate that like, actually, no, this was intentional, and like they're going to keep using this language in spite of having been asked not to, like, okay, then like, you know, my objection doesn't apply. But I think we should give people the opportunity to demonstrate good intent.
Yeah, I think that I think that I would like
you're
to.
Muted. Oh.
I'm not muted. Can anyone else hear me?
You're not
Okay.
muted. My client just has a delay. Sorry.
So yeah, so I think that overall, if we do the stack rank of open source projects, I think that Kubernetes is pretty good about some of the stuff that we do, and I think that we do have levers in place to handle contributors that are not you know, living up to the standards and values that we have for the project. So so yes, I agree on the handling bad actors portion, and again, I don't want this to I don't want this to, you know, the implication to be that we're trying to malign anyone who had previously contributed code. I think that it is also important that we not turn this into a bike shed. If this is a good idea, we should say it's a good idea, and we can work on tightening up this proposal. I think we should work on moving forward with the work. My biggest concern here is that we spend more time talking about these things that are not moving the goalpost forward.
Just to jump in on that, I think we will actually make more progress if we set our goals and principles in terms of like being helpful, and like that's a much easier thing to get on board with, and a much easier thing to connect changes to. Like, say, this is unhelpful. Let's make this more helpful. So I think in terms of making progress, we will actually make much more progress if we avoid like setting the bar at everyone has to agree that this term is inherently has this meaning or that meaning. Like, some people think it's very clear, some people think it's not clear. If you make that the bar, I think we'll get mired down in arguments. So we can say like this would be more helpful. Let's be helpful. Let's be kind to each other. Like, I think we'll make lots more progress.
I think in the kindness, it's important to note that a bit to Clayton's previous point, that like this should be additive. It's not just being more helpful. I think it's important to acknowledge that this language is potentially harmful to people, right? And calling that out in goals. So so I do plan to still do that.
So I have first a comment and then a question. So first a comment. Yeah, I agree. I agree with what Stephen just said a moment ago, and I wanted to highlight that as far as goals here, yes, if we can achieve the added benefit of being more clear and more technically accurate, great. But I think it's also important to recognize whether you call it racist or not, whether you call it hateful or not, the language itself is problematic. And correcting and finding different ways to describe some of these things is definitely a goal, at least from what I've seen and what I've, you know, people I've spoken to, like that is in itself a goal, is to like correct and change language that is problematic, and identifying which language is problematic, whatever you call it, and trying to correct that in wherever we can, whether it's our documentation or code base and that kind of stuff. So that is in itself a goal, not just being more technically accurate. That is, a bonus. If we can do both, great. My question is, and this is more directed towards like Stephen, Celeste, and Zach. Do you see, so like you've spoken about policies that will be kind of like a goal, like an exit criteria of this working group. Do you see those policies as binding or non-binding? If they're guidance
Binding
versus like binding policies that we have to adhere to. The reason I ask this is, and why it's important for this group as well, is where that output resides. If it's guidance, that is something like a policy that can come over to contributor experience, but contributor experience doesn't really do a lot of binding policies. Binding policies on things like naming in code should probably exist in architecture rather than contributor experience. So as far as like sponsoring the working group and like that kind of stuff, that's something that this audience should be aware of. If you are looking for binding, that would be part of the buy-off, is those outputs of those policies should probably reside here.
So I honestly think it's a combination of both of them. I think I mentioned in the email that we are looking to provide both guidance and policy. I think the policy would be that the policy could potentially be that people who are doing API review should be reviewing the guidelines set forth by wherever, some link, right? So if this is a part of the API review process, and then we ensure that I think that we have a lot of things in the project that are binding, maybe, right? Things that continue to evolve over time. I don't think that there's anything that we've laid down that just exists and that's it, right? So I think that giving the opportunity for evolution of these policies over time, I think that I think that saying that a part of the API review should be ensuring more inclusive language is a reasonable policy to set. Right?
And just to sort of add to that, and I guess give a little context, and I'll put my hand down after this one. So for those of you who don't know me, I work with Zach as a technical writer for the CNCF. And this is something the CNCF is looking at implementing broadly across all projects, potentially as an entrance requirement. We don't know yet. So there's that. And as I sort of mentioned in my initial comment to the Kubernetes issue, from a technical writing perspective, I have seen this particular discussion happen 6, 7, 8 times. It happens every couple of years. Something racist happens in the media. People start looking at their own lives and going, how can I help reduce the harm that's happening? They look at their code base and go, wow, I should stop using these harmful words in my code base. And they say, but it's really hard to change tests, and it's really hard to change class names, and our customers will have to deal with breaking changes, and we're going to change it in the documentation, or we're going to make guidelines and put them into a non-binding form that doesn't actually affect the code base, and then I'm going to step away. And every single time these initiatives fail, because it's not taken into the core of the project. So unlike Stephen, I'm going to push towards the idea that at least some of these recommendations will be binding, because I promise you we will end up in the exact same place in 3 years if we don't. And we're going to have this conversation again.
Yeah, so I'm wearing a few hats right now as elder of the project, and also as a member of the Code of Conduct Committee, which is ostensibly charged with maintaining inclusivity across the entire organization. And what I want to say is that what we're talking about with changing these terms is harm reduction, because these terms are doing harm to our project, to our community, to contributors who have to deal with the direct implications of what these terms mean in their lives and their experience. Sometimes in very broad ways that are important signals as to the level of inclusivity of our project, our community. Thankfully, the world is waking up to the necessity of this change. And I think that I want to sort of harken into something Stephen was saying that's really important and very subtle. And I also want to be cognizant of the racial and gender makeup of the people discussing this right now. And just take a look at the Brady Bunch view of who we are and what we're discussing and the implications of it. And there is a marked imbalance in this conversation inherently, and it's very important to acknowledge that first and foremost. So with that said, I want to acknowledge what Stephen said and say that in a way, just debating this, the merits of it or the not merits of it, we're past that, in my opinion. There is no discussion to be had here. The discussion has been made in history. It's being made right now in our lives, in our cities, in our streets. These terms just need to go. They're not accurate, they're lazy, whatever that is. I don't really care. What I care about is these terms are harmful. We have to remove them, just like we need to remove a cancer from a body so it doesn't spread. This is work that should be binding. This is work that should be enduring and staffed. We as white people should be staffing this. Stephen, as a non-white person, should not have to bear that burden in addition to the burden of the harm that these words create. We owe it to our community. We owe it to each other. We owe it to Stephen. We owe it to every person who ever feels like they are left out because they look different than the vast majority of people in this call. We have to support them. It's our job. It's our job as a community, and we have to lead by example. I will personally step up and do what I need to do to support this effort, and I hope that everyone else will too. And I'm not asking whether it's technically correct or if it's an inconvenience or whatever. It doesn't matter. We have to reduce the harm.
Yeah, I think we've been debating a lot whether or not we call these things, how we call these things, and saying that, oh, we can't call them bad because then we're blaming people or something. I don't think anything in Stephen's proposal suggests that we're blaming someone for saying something racist. We're saying that these terms have these meanings are not okay, we need to change them. We're not blaming anyone and saying, oh, you are being racist. We're saying these terms are offensive, let's remove them. I don't think that needs more debate here. I don't think that relates to SIG architecture at all. I think the only thing we need to know is, can we produce some policy and put it into the review process? I want to make one further comment. I think in terms of a time bound for this, Aaron's comment is about what I would have expected. We should produce policy. We should reconcile that policy against pre-existing language, and we should find the convergence point between that policy existing and being applied to future work and the past work being cleaned up. And then that is the end of the work group. And the other SIGs will own continuing to apply the policy through things like API review, documentation review, etc.
So I wanted to make the observation that trying to make language more welcoming and more helpful in a project is positively framed, and it's really easy to support that goal. But trying to create a working group that is going to designate certain words as harmful or identify words that are already harmful, maybe another way to phrase it, seems significantly broader. And I would expect that to fall more into a code of conduct sort of situation, and not a working group sponsored just by SIG Arch. I mean, I've looked through the proposals in this list, the use non-racist language doc, and I want to enhance clarity, but I'm not really sure that labeling words like deprecated as harmful is what people would expect, as opposed to looking through something in the list and saying, oh, well, deprecated isn't very helpful to me. And it's not obvious to me yet how we as a group decide which ones are and which ones aren't problematic. And I'd really like to know that when the working group, if that's what the working group is going to figure out, I'd like to know that at the end and call that maybe one logical stopping point. And if it's known already, and we're going to apply that policy inside the working group, I'd like to understand what that process is and how to participate.
So just to speak to that document, just because I was the one who wrote it, it's very much a work in progress, and the lower half of that document is very much broad ideas, which I have not evaluated yet. This is the idea of how we decide something is harmful versus non-harmful is a really difficult subject. In regards to the two deeply contentious word pairings that we have to deal with right now, master slave and blacklist whitelist, I have erred on the side of looking at academic research and other precedents within the computing community to see, is there kind of independently verified research around the implications of these terms? Has somebody actually taken the time to go and do that? And B, what are our peers elsewhere in the community doing? And C, as others have mentioned, are we even using the term correctly? Because I think if we look at, for example, something like taints and tolerations, we're not using the word taint like other computing packages, code bases, etc. use a similar word. So we're twisting a metaphor in that case. So to answer your question shortly, my current heuristic is, does this seem like something I can back up with research? But that is an individual heuristic and not one decided by a group. And I think that that's probably the first topic of discussion.
Okay, because I will say that, like, I think having consensus by some sort of a group with rules that are well known and observed by everyone will make it be easier to get people to accept conclusions, as opposed to it being a person sitting and deciding.
So I'll be quick. I think it was just there's a side chat going on through this whole thing, and I just want to re-emphasize everything that everybody has said here and indicate support for the entire effort. In terms of how we write the charter for this, I think it's important that we focus on the positive and not the negative, because feelings are hard and because people can feel defensive, and that's not the intention here, right? Nobody's charging whoever came up with the term master or whitelist, blacklist of being hateful or intentionally terms. They were common terms of art, and we're evolving, we are becoming enlightened. And so if we focus the wording in the charter on using more inclusive language as opposed to eliminating hateful language, it's a really subtle distinction, but I think it's important in cutting off meaningless debate. But I don't think that we need to water down what we're doing. I don't think we should be afraid of the values that we're trying to express here, that we want to be more meaningful, and that the situation in the world is in fact the catalyst for this. And that's okay. Even if black-white wasn't racially charged, we would still want to change away from blacklist and whitelist because it would be better for our code. But that is not the only reason, and we shouldn't try to paper over these changes by saying, well, it's better technically, ignore the rest. So that's all. And I don't think anybody's actually saying that we should paper these things over. I'm just saying we can embrace our values, be inclusive, and not be accusatory, even the slightest little subtlest bit in the way we write this. That's all.
I asked a question in chat and I wanted to know if SIG Arch was in favor of the change. I didn't really necessarily hear that with a whitelist blacklist change. For example, if I submit a PR today, would it get approved?
I don't think it would. I mean, we already changed the existing instances of documentation and API docs, and now that this is on our radar, I think this would be something that we would steer towards other terms for. I kind of wanted to avoid like one-off questions. If we were going to have a group that was going to look at like this holistically, that seemed like a good thing to have that group look at. But yeah, if someone opened a PR today to add a new instance of that, I think we would guide to better terms. And if we want to adjust API guidance kind of proactively with like one-off things like that, I don't object to that, but it seemed like it might be easier to do it as part of the work group. But
Jordan, it's still your turn, and then
I did want to note something. I think when there is an example of something that there's broad agreement over, like the whitelist blacklist thing, I think Daniel said, and I would agree. I don't think anyone would be opposed to guidance around that and moving away from that. It's easy to say things sort of the way Jace said them, which on the one hand, I agree with these particular terms, but I disagree with the approach, which is to say, like, the debate is over, like, there's no debate. These need to go, they need to go now. White people should staff this. Like, for these particular terms, I think there is agreement, but I want to be careful that we don't bypass discussion and understanding in the future just because someone says this term is harmful. And this is kind of the Supreme Court method of looking at something. Like, we're not just deciding this one particular instance, we're also, the way we respond here will also have implications in the future. And so being considered and having the discussion, even if it's very clear to some people in the community that I don't know what discussion we're having, I think it's important to have the discussion for the benefit of the people who need to live under the decision. And if it's as clear and unequivocal as we think it is, then I think the discussion will be able to be had and the decision will be able to be made. So I think part of that is what we're doing here, part of that is what we're talking about doing in the working group. I'm in favor of sort of transparent methods for making decisions about these things. And so the more we can do that, I think the better off we'll be.
So sorry to cut through all of this, but the reason that I have I asked Celeste and Zach and a few of the other people that are on the call to attend this meeting is so that we could have a decision from SIG architecture regarding the formation of the working group. So sorry to cut through the list, but I would love to hear from the chairs.
Stephen, we still have a little bit of time. So I don't think we'll get to anything else today, but let's, there's people still in the queue. Let's wrap up with them, please. So I have this, my turn, so let me speak a few minutes. So, so far, we haven't, so one of the things that Paris mentioned was, okay, if I submit a PR, will you merge it immediately? So we have other things that are already in the community, right? Like we have, we have language around deprecation policies and things like that. So I think we have to like look at those things as well, for sure, and not, just try to fix the problem ASAP. But then this will, the problem Celeste highlighted will come back again, which is like, it's hard to do this change. And then, how do we make sure that we are not in the same position as we were before? So that comes. So if there is something like that, then we would have to like take a vote, I guess, to push things through. But in general, I'm very supportive of this. Let's do it for sure. Wearing my SIG Arch hat. So I'll yield to Christoph.
Yeah, my point is very brief, and that it's a lot of the details here can be solved in the next kind of 2 steps in the working group formation process, which are first like finessing the charter and making sure the goals are clear and agreed on by all the sponsoring SIGs, and then the actual work that the working group would do to develop the policies. As far as like this stage right here, I would just encourage SIG Architecture to like sponsor the working group. Obviously, there's a lot of strong feelings here around what we're trying to do, and the vast majority of them are supportive of the work that this working group is trying to do. So yeah, that was my entire comment. It's just like, let's sponsor the working group, and then we can figure out all the details from there, because that's the whole point of the working group.
Zach.
I'll pass my turn for the moment if we could come back to me.
I'll just jump in then. So in principle, I'm in support of the working group and the goals. I think there are details around the transparency of how the decisions are made, and that will be part of the charter and part of the moving the actual work, as said. So that's a SIG chair. That's my statement.
So since nobody else is in the queue, Clayton asked about is it gonna affect the code of conduct? I think we have to review everything. We have to review governance. We have to review code of conduct. We have to review API review process. I think everything should be on the table at this point for this group.
Is going to be covered in this working group, or if there's a separate process going on for that. That was most of what I didn't know whether that was part of the working group, and SIG Arch was sponsoring code of conduct committee in the structure.
So I guess to ask Jace on the call, right? Does it make sense for, it sounds like the answer is yes. Does it make sense for code of conduct committee to also be a sponsor here?
Yes, I feel strongly that we should at least have one person from the committee involved in the working group. Yeah, we're not sponsoring, but we're participating. We're stakeholders in this discussion.
Zach, then Derek.
So of the motions that I've heard so far, to create a board of review that ensures whether people are comfortable with changes or not, I think this is a terrible idea. And I think this is because if we put a person who was harmed by language to the experience of determining whether or not that harm was real, based on other people who don't also share that experience, we are never going to remediate the harm done. It will just keep on going, because it will be a long litany of people saying, well, I was not harmed by this, and I don't think that it could be harmful. So it will just dilute the work that needs to be done entirely. It will keep on perpetuating harm. So I don't think that this should be a review board. Like well, I think it's important to trust that the work of the working group will have the people in it necessary to make the informed changes that are going to stop harm and make the project more welcoming. And I don't think that we should be subject to whether or not white people are comfortable with changes to language that people of color tell them are racist. I think that's never going to produce a happy or a healthy result. So I think that turns into a bike shed very quickly. And I have no interest in participating in that particular bike shed.
Zach, nobody was saying that this is a review board. This was more of like who all need to participate in this working group and make sure that their voices are there. So in this case, the Code of Conduct Committee was not there in the original email thread. Now we made that connection saying we need to make sure that they are involved, along with steering as well.
Certainly. Thank you for the clarification. I was referring earlier to the proposal to create a Supreme Court and the idea that, I disagree that the color of your skin determines your value for being comfortable.
Thank you. Derek?
Yeah, so I guess speaking as the other SIG chair on SIG Arch, I'm in favor of the working group. I think what we need to talk about are the next steps. So like, to my knowledge, there wasn't a pull request that we can officially +1 or endorse. I feel like there's been feedback in this call about potential updates that could be made to that proposal. And I will leave it to Stephen and the proposal authors to decide if they want to make those updates. But I think for myself, I would +1 this and look forward to seeing the final PR.
For sure, we should start the process of doing whatever is needed in the infrastructure side to get you all started, Stephen. So I don't think nobody's going to hesitate to do that from our side.
I don't know if I'm just going to restate what's already been said, but sort of verbally say what I said in chat. I view sort of the life cycle of this working group in 3 distinct phases. 1, make a punch list, which Celeste has sort of put together some of the really obvious things. 2, come up with a set of policies that we can use as guidance going forward. I kind of feel like one of those policies should be how we determine, things to add to the punch list going forward. And then 3 is reconciliation against the policies that we collectively have agreed upon. And I get it, I'm a white guy saying this, and I heard Jace's passion, and that this is beyond debate. And for the items that are currently on the punch list, I would agree. And I also hear Zach saying that we don't want to put any more burden on those who feel compelled to speak up. But I do want to ensure that one of the policies that comes out of this working group is how we do come to that decision. So I'm willing to make sure that the folks in the working group put their trust in an appropriate set of people or person. I'm not sure. I could envision a scenario where it's sort of the Code of Conduct Committee kind of comes up with suggestions down the line or amendments down the line. But I do feel like we need to have a process for amending our punch lists or our policies going forward. That's all. I am vociferously in support of this effort. Just want to make sure that the decision-making process adheres to the values of this project. And so in general, I think we favor inclusivity, and in general, I think we favor transparency. I recognize there are times where we need to be sensitive, but yeah, I just hope we take that into account. And that's me speaking, I guess, as a steering committee member.
So from my side, the other thing I want to say here is that there is work to be done, right? We don't have enough people of color who are here, right? So we have work to do in terms of mentoring, getting more people on board, and get them to positions of influence and power, that kind of stuff. We need to do a lot more work there as well. This is not the end of the story by just making some changes in some documentation or some code. We have to like get this into what we do on a day-to-day basis, I think.
Can I just add that I have absolute faith and trust in all of us to do the right thing? That's what's drawn me to the community in the beginning, and it's what remains a draw for me today. That you all have huge hearts, you care, you work hard, and we can do this, and we can do it in a way that doesn't destroy our project or our community. We can do this together.
Okay, well, thank you all for the discussion. I think, Stephen, it sounds like we're ready to move forward on getting a PR out there and seeing what it looks like. And if there's no other comments, we are pretty much at time.
Thanks, Stephen.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye.
Jordan.
Thank you all. We'll see you in 2 weeks.